Good morning. This really is like a family reunion, even though some of you are here for the first time. I hope you felt that last night at the reception, that they talk about 7 degrees of separation. I think in this room it's probably about 3. We don't have to go very far before we meet someone who's like us in some way, who's sharing the passion that we have, who works in the kind of setting that we do, or the kind of community that we do, or the kind of organization that we do, or is really tackling a challenge that's similar to the kind that we're tackling. So this really is a family, and I'm excited every year that I get to stand up and talk with you all for a while. I do a lot of public speaking. Those of you who know that you can just have me stand up and I will just start to talk. It doesn't take much. But I think a lot about what to do here every year, because this really is the opportunity with you all to test out the ideas that are going to go on the road for the next year. And so each year when I come here, I say, what have we learned from you over the past year? How can we synthesize it and put it together to make sure that you're pushing out there to bring a little bit more precision to the passion that we know you have for changing the odds for young people? And so I started, as Marita said, to go in a whole different direction, and then I went back, looked at the slides from last year, realized that I had named this year's presentation the same as last year's presentation, and said, well, I'm not going to give you last year's presentation, but I'm really going to stick with the themes that were there and tell you where I think we've actually grown them and expanded them or challenged them, or you all have challenged whether we push them far enough. So that's what I want to do a little bit of you with this morning. This is always an unfinished story that I'm sharing. This is family, so I'm trying it on you all first. If it doesn't work, let us know, because our job really is to help you figure out how to move ideas to impact. That's the tagline for the forum, moving ideas to impact. And we have the luxury of learning from you, learning with you, moving back and forth between research, policy, and practice. And we really try to bring the best of those ideas to you. But in the end, you have to take them, you have to use them, and you have to know how to really push them through to impact. And that's what we're going to do. So this idea of readiness has been around for a while. We like the term readiness. We talk about early childhood readiness. Now we talk about college and career readiness. It's a good universal term to suggest what we're helping young people do, which is grow and develop and be prepared for success. I just want to start out with some recent things that have come across my desk and come across the radar screen. This study came out from ACT, came out about a month ago. And if we're going to talk about readiness, we need to look at the fact that right now, only 1 in 10 African-American students are college ready, according to ACT study. So the achievement gaps between Hispanic and African-American students and their Asian American and white counterparts still remain substantial. We have more and more young people of color who are actually applying to college. That's a good thing, who are taking the ACTs. So those numbers are growing. But even with those numbers growing, we still have gaps. And the gaps are not just because the numbers are growing. The numbers have been, these gaps have been steady. So I won't read them off the screen to you, but we can see that if you're defining readiness for college in the traditional way of being able to hit certain thresholds, which ACT has measured in their benchmarks of English, reading, mathematics, and science, our young people are not doing well. Our African-American young people in particular are not doing well. And so I've spent a year, last year we talked about readiness and equity, and I spent a year on the road really digging into that equity question. Palm Beach, because they're our friends, helped us host one of the most intensive conversations that we had on readiness and equity, what we called a dinner and a day, with young people and folks from across the community, from the school district, really digging in to look behind the numbers to say, what is going on? What is really going on here? And that's the kind of conversation we need to have. And so I'm going to spend a little time talking to you about why. So we've got that perplexing number that just doesn't change. We're not moving the needle on that. We know, however, that readiness is more than a diploma. That's what the Ready by 21 meetings have always been about. It's not just about those scores on ACT or those test scores or your grades from school. We know it's more than a diploma. We've known that and had it codified back in 2002 by the National Research Council. when they put out community programs that promote youth development, and they told us that when you look at the research about adult success happens when young people are developed physically, intellectually, emotionally, and socially. And the green words are the words that we've now started to pop up across the country and across our fields to tell us about social and emotional skills, 21st century skills, character, et cetera. We're getting down to the specifics of saying, how do we make sure young people have these skills and competencies? And that's great. But we've known this for a while, that they need a range of skills and competencies to be able to be successful and to be ready to be successful. Over the last couple years more recently, we've had folks that are really digging in to codify what it means to be successful. And I talked about this last year. I talk about it every place I go. By far, my favorite sort of treatment of what it means for young adults to be successful was done by the Chicago Consortium for School Research at the University of Chicago, funded by the Wallace Foundation. I can't see Chris, but I think we cleaned out their stockpile of these reports. So we have them on the resource table, not enough for everybody. So if you're here with a team of 12, don't take 12. But definitely stop by the resource table and make sure each of your teams has one. I think we have about 200 copies. You can also go to their website and download a wonderful 2-page infographic that I sort of have a dog-eared copy that I carry around with me. But I want to take a second to help you understand how to go from a list of skills, which is where we often are now. We're asking, which of these skills should we develop? Should it be grit? Should it be persistence? Should it be problem solving? And the question is all of them. And then the question is how. So the thing that the Chicago Consortium did so well was to take us to the end of the story and then work backwards. What are we really trying to do to help young people be successful? Well, again, much like the National Research Council, what they discovered looking at the research in schools, in communities, and they didn't just look at schools. Schools, communities, youth organizations, places where young people spend their time learning, and business, where young people end up ultimately in employment. Young adult success is connected to their ability to create an integrated identity that's robust enough to move with them as they move back and forth across different settings, a set of competencies that let them be successful at the things they are trying to do, and a sense of agency, a sense that they actually can go in and do the things that they want to do, that they have enough control to be able to manage things that come their way. Agency, identity, competencies. That's what we're helping young people build. And any of you that work with adolescents know that's what they're working on every day. How to have that sense of agency, really how to build an identity that's both flexible enough and robust enough to serve them well as they move back and forth between settings that can often be very different in terms of how they greet young people, what they expect of young people, and then how to build this broad set of competencies, which certainly includes academic skills, but isn't limited to that at all. The second thing that they did was to give us some really useful language to help us categorize this often endless list of skills and competencies that we want to build. And there are lots of ways to summarize these, but I really like theirs. They basically said, first, we're talking about and need to pull out this category of self-regulation or emotion management, right? Not because it's the only thing, but because basically, if you can't control your fight or flight syndrome, you can't have enough control over how you come into a place, then you often aren't able to stay in that place. And learning starts with being there. So we really need to make sure young people have that sense that they can come in and manage their emotions. That doesn't mean repress them. That means manage them. If you need to be angry and it's appropriate to be angry, get angry. But know that that's what you're doing. So they pull that out and make that separate. I like the fact that they combine knowledge and skills, those sort of not so much mindsets, but skill sets that you need, problem solving, critical thinking, et cetera, that really come together. The National Commission on Social, Emotional, and Academic Development talks about integrating social, emotional, and academic development, and that's what they've done when they've talked about the knowledge and skills that young people need to have. And then the mindsets really are, we talk about growth mindset, et cetera. We know how important it is for young people to have the right kind of approach to learning, to failure, to success, to development. And then I like the fact that they don't shy away from a category called values. All of this has to be put through your value system. And if we think it's just about teaching young people skills and not about helping young people really explore their values, which we don't teach, we help them explore, we help them reflect on them. Their values are really built by their families and their communities, and they struggle with them. So I like that. And the final thing that makes this work is if we understand that that's what young people are going through developmentally, and these pieces develop at different points in time. And if you download the two-pager, you'll see that they go through this sort of graphic from a developmental perspective and show you basically when the lights turn on in these various areas. We don't end up doing all these things at once. But the last thing that is really useful about this is that they simplify what makes learning happen, what makes development happen. It's a combination of giving young people opportunities to act and reflect. It's that simple. That's what we do. That's how we grow and learn. We act and we reflect. And they break that down further to tell us the kind of words that we mean. So if we're practitioners and we're saying, how do we make sure young people are growing in development and developing so that they really can be successful, we want to step into a room and see these kind of actions happening and see that there are opportunities for reflection, for young people to evaluate, to describe, to make connections between one thing that they're doing and another. We want to know this is happening. That's what good learning settings look like, really broken down to this combination of action and reflection. So I took a minute on that because I really think we have a need to cut through the multiple frameworks and language lists and really get back to what are we trying to help young people do? We are trying to help them be ready for college, for work, for life, for wherever they're going. We're trying to help them move through childhood and adolescence into adult success. So, last year, if you were here, I played a little video of my grandson. How many people were here last year? How many people would like to say, I can do it all by myself? Come on, I can do it all by myself. You heard him say this 23 times on a video, and what he was doing was demonstrating that he had figured out how to get into his new big boy bed. And there was a place you have to get up on the bed. He didn't like sort of flopping onto it and trying to crawl up. So he went to the bathroom, he got the little stool for brushing your teeth, he brought it back, and he walked into his bed. And so you see him, they send a little video of him demonstrating to his grandparents that he can do this all by himself. And he's walking up the stairs into the bed and coming back down, and walking up the stairs into the bed and coming back down. I can do it all by myself. The joy of mastery was clear in his expression, his voice. He was just so proud of himself that he had figured out how to do this. He was prepared by his parents to be able to do it. It could have been a scary thing if he just walked in and saw that they took away his crib and put this new bed in place, but he had gone through the process with him and he was prepared. So we learned last year the importance of making sure that young people have that sense of joy throughout childhood and adolescence, that they can do things by themselves. That's agency. I figured out how to do this by myself. What I want to do, however, is talk to you a little bit about the fact that no video this year, because Theo has a baby brother and he didn't do that by himself. So that's Eli. So we're now busy being an older brother to Eli and figuring out how to do that as a part of a family. But I want to spend a little time talking to you about the fact that we really are trying to own the "it takes a village to raise a child" proverb, and the fact that I, getting here to this stage today, didn't do it all by myself. So that's me. That's me at 3 with my panda. Yes, there is a resemblance between Theo and me. We're hoping there's not a resemblance between Eli and the panda. But let's talk a little bit. I just want to reflect. I do this every now and then. As Thaddeus tells me, I don't do it often enough. But let me just reflect a little bit on why I was ready for college, work, and life. Now, you could say, why wouldn't you be ready? Well, my demographics suggested that I shouldn't be ready. I grew up in Washington, D.C., single-parent family, low-income neighborhood, D.C. public schools. You tell anybody those, and you say, well, she was probably one of those, young people in the 9 and 10 who wasn't ready for college. But I was one of the 1 in 10. And I really have spent my career trying to figure out what was it that had me be that one so we can make more. So my path to readiness, as I said, I grew up in a low-income neighborhood in D.C. That's actually the street that I grew up on, not exactly the house, but the street that I grew up on. But what it really is the street where I spent most of my time in middle childhood through early adolescence, which was actually not where my mother lived. So again, my dad died when I was 7. I had 2 older sisters who then were sort of shortly out of the house. My mom worked long hours, and so I stayed with my godmother during the week in a house that looked like that. And then I went home on the weekends. And my mother would come visit me after dinner once or twice a week to make sure I was doing fine, but that all felt perfectly normal to me. I described that to other people, and they go, oh, how could you do that? Well, that's what made sense. It allowed us to have stability. It allowed me to make sure there was someone there when I came home. There were people there to help me do my homework. So my mother had a creative way of making sure I had all the things that I needed. I was lucky enough to go to the D.C. public schools in what was called the Renaissance era for the D.C. public schools. They had worked with folks at Columbia University to figure out ways to really tackle white flight. As the schools became desegregated and folks left the schools, they brought educational experts in to say, what can we do? And so they ended up developing an education whole school model that brought young people from across the city together to really test out whether you could have an integrated school experience for young people and do it in a very intentional way. This was still when tracking was happening. I happened to be in one of the top tracks, but it was very clear there was no bluebirds and redwoods. The tracks were 1 through 14, and you knew exactly where you were, but it was also made very clear to you that you could move around in the tracks if you worked hard, and people actually did. People moved down, and people moved up. So I went to an intentionally integrated junior high school and an intentionally integrated high school in which the expectations for everyone were high, whatever track you were in. And I went back, and I didn't pull up a picture of this. I went back and looked at my high school yearbook about 10 years ago just to make sure I was remembering it correctly. And every young person, when you looked at their names, every young person was in at least 2 clubs or extracurricular activities. And when you looked at the photos of who was in those clubs, there was only 1 club that wasn't integrated. And it wasn't the cheerleaders, it was the Latin club. And the Latin club was all African-American kids. So the public schools were doing something right. And I got a very good education in the broadest sense of education. The other thing in my life was the DC Youth Orchestra. Internationally known, set up by a music teacher in the DC public schools who decided that they really needed to provide an opportunity for young people, again, to come together from across the city, not just within their school, to be able to learn and appreciate music, and that to combat the fact that many young people couldn't afford private lessons. They would start early. So you've got little kids learning to play the violin. They would provide lessons for free, and they would build a program all the way up to a professional orchestra. I was actually there. It's a small picture. The DC Youth Orchestra in 1969, my senior year, actually played at the White House. So those are the kind of experiences that I had as a young person that actually helped me get ready and helped me basically not be a young person who beat the odds, but actually come from a school, a family, a faith organization, a community that somehow magically worked together to have consistent expectations and rich opportunities that actually changed the odds for me and my peers. And I'm not saying that everybody was as successful as I was, but the expectation was there. The opportunities were there. So if you took advantage of them, it made a difference. So this concept, which we've talked about, obviously it's up here on the panels, of changing the odds for young people, not just beating the odds, is an important one. The language for that and the understanding of what that is came to me when I was working at the Children's Defense Fund. And Marion Wright Edelman set up the first Beating the Odds Award. And CDF still gives out a Beating the Odds Award every year to a couple of young people who have overcome incredible adversity in their lives. And that's important. We clearly want to acknowledge and celebrate young people who have beaten the odds. But that's not our job, to celebrate young people who have managed to overcome adversity. Our job is to reduce adversity. And we can only do that by taking a systemic approach to making sure that we really are changing the odds for young people. Resiliency is important, but it's a fallback. It's not a solution. So the second thing that happened to me once I got to college, and I found consistently in the first 6 weeks of college, I can't tell you how many, well, two things happened, and I didn't put this picture up, but you'll see a little picture later on. Two things happened when I got to college. One, I had to get used to the fact that people wanted to pat my head. How many people in the audience have had that pat your head experience? All right, so, 69, 70, you take away your ponytail, you create an afro, and people just want to come up and pat your head. So you get used to that. But the second thing was, as I said, from students to professors, all being pleasantly surprised at how prepared I was. So that's where this conversation about beat the odds versus changing the odds came from. I didn't know that I was the exception. I didn't feel like I was the exception. I didn't feel like people had treated me like the exception. But even on the way to college, we went to a high school great high school, but there was, one counselor for every 400 students. And so those who were going off to college, there was a program that you could go downtown and sit with sort of a college recruiter and talk about what your interests were, show them your SAT scores, and they would sort of help you think about where to go to college. So a friend and I went down, waited our turn. I came in, I sat down. He said, well, tell me what your SAT scores are. I said, well, 730. And he said, okay, 730 is a good score. We can get you into school with 730. And I went, well, wait a minute. That was just my math score. Let me tell you the other score. Again, I sit in a chair. I'm from a DC public school. He assumes that's my combined score. This is the kind of thing that we need to talk about. It's not just preparing young people who have not done well. It's also changing expectations so that you're not, if you have done well, if you are prepared, people aren't surprised. And so in the first 4 or 5 weeks of college, I met people who were just pleasantly surprised. It's like, wow, you're so articulate, you're so prepared, it's like, what did you expect? I mean, I didn't know that this was something that I didn't know that I was the exception until I showed up at a predominantly white college, and clearly, I was the exception. Now, they didn't question the fact that I was there. They just thought that they were going to have to mold me to be ready, that I wasn't going to show up ready. So this idea got in my head of what's going on there, and I puzzled with it for the first year that I was there, and then luckily, at the end of my first year, I met David Weichert. Yes, there is a connection. David Weichert, Weichert Center for Youth Program Quality. Dave Weichert started the High Scope Educational Research Foundation to really promote this idea of active learning as a way to make sure young people from disadvantaged circumstances really change the odds, that we could change the odds for them and close those gaps. Whether those young people were in special education, they were in low-income schools, this was really his commitment, and he was in the Detroit public schools and the Ypsilanti public schools. He couldn't get all these. He started this stuff in preschool. How many people are familiar with the Perry Preschool Project? All right. Well, that's the Weichert Center. That's the High Scope Educational Research Foundation. Dave Weichert was the person who put that Perry Preschool Project in place, and that preschool is still running, and Joe's daughter goes to the preschool. But in this space, he also wanted room to figure out how to take this idea of active learning up into adolescence. And so he and his wife set up an educational camp for teenagers. And that's a picture from the camp, and that's me. I was one of the first counselors who was recruited to be a camp counselor at Dave Weichert's camp in 1970. Yes, if I didn't give you that arrow, you probably just would have thought I was a 15-year-old boy, but that really is me. Sitting there with my hiking boots and afro. This was such an amazing experience that David Weichert had figured out how to help young people like me come in and with 3 days training, figure out how to create an absolutely intentionally rich community for teens 12 to 18 from everywhere from Germany to the Mississippi Delta to come into, build a sense of community that was completely committed to learning and development. And I'd like to tell you much more about what that intentionality looked like. And I'll give you a couple little snippets in a minute, but recommend the book Learning Comes to Life, which was written by one of the folks who was a counselor with me, Ellen Ilfeld, and I wrote the introduction. I think this was back in '94 that we went back to document what was happening in the camp. But I came out of that. I went off to college thinking I was going to be a math teacher. I came out of that realizing I didn't want to be a teacher because I'd learned such a profoundly different way to do learning that didn't fit into the public schools, that I had to figure out how we got those ideas about learning into the water. And that's what I've been doing for the past almost 50 years. So that's really what is going on. And most recently, with the Weichert Center and the work that we just did with the Susan Crown Exchange to bring practitioners together to talk about what are those skills and competencies that they're trying to help young people develop so they can be successful, I went back and thought through and looked through Learning Comes to Life. And sure enough, this is what it was about, constructing an environment in which everything from, there was no setting in which we weren't being intentional, whether that was meals, it was time in the rooms, every setting was an intentional opportunity to build those skills, to make sure we help young people solve problems, to make sure that they were interacting, that they were taking initiative. Young people were regrouped every year to every week to make sure that they weren't forming cliques, but they were getting an opportunity to be as diverse as possible in opportunities to build friendships and to take initiative. That's across age, it's across race, obviously not across gender in terms of bedrooms, but very intentional opportunity to create an 8-week community that models what we would like our communities to look like. So that's where I got the foundation. Just to give you a quick sense that the same kind of research that was done in Perry Preschool actually was done on this adolescent work. Dave Weichert and his team brought this idea, after testing it, back to the public schools and developed this idea called challenging the potential, where teachers and what was called talented disadvantaged young people were brought for 2 weeks out to the camp to work together to really just reset the button about expectations, about relationships, so that everybody could see you really could, in the right kind of environment, get young people and teachers to recalibrate who they were, how they work together, and what their expectations are of each other, and to see what they can do in a very relationship-rich way. Now, they were working on academic things from computers to whatever, but they were doing it again with that understanding that we have to first create a learning environment with high expectations and rich opportunities for relationships. And what you see there is basically when they did the longitudinal study, decided young people who had that kind of immersion experience and then went back to their schools with a different peer group and a set of teachers who had different expectations and relationships with them, did it make a difference? And the short answer is yes. You can see that the students who went through the high scope experience 5 years later, after graduation, had higher post-secondary outcomes, and also the students who were identified as underachievers even had a richer experience. that it flipped and allowed them to flip the narrative and come back and lean in to achievement and graduation and success. I won't read them, but again, I think they're big enough for you to read. At the conclusion, the study recommends things for students and things for schools, and the things that they recommended, as you can see, to make sure young people really are developing that sense of agency and identity to be able to succeed are exactly the kind of things that we're still hopefully talking about today. And again, this was done I think this book was done, I think, in about 2004. So we know this stuff, and we can document this stuff. And the point that I'm going to continue to make over the next 20 minutes or so is we shouldn't let ourselves get too narrow into saying, how are we going to build a skill? How are we going to do a particular thing? How are we going to bring in a curriculum? This is really about resetting expectations. It's about intentionally creating experiences and opportunities for young people from elementary school all the way through to college to be in diverse, positive, multi-ethnic settings, to broaden their sources of positive influence, to make sure that their parents are really helping them and involved and engaged. And we always struggle with what's the parent involvement thing. And this was really addressed directly, and you'll see it addressed in the book. And then to build skills like problem solving, et cetera. So that's what I learned. So that, I mean, it took a while for all this to be codified and written into books, but at 19, I understood this, and I understood that I needed to figure out how to move this stuff forward. So I stayed connected to HighScope. Many of our staff are from HighScope. I was on the board of HighScope, and then obviously when the moment came that HighScope decided they wanted to stay in the early childhood business and not really leverage this rich research base, as well as a set of assessment and training tools that were based on this research, we actually brought the Weichert Center into the forum to be able to move ideas to impact. Because I had the ideas, but Weichert in its own way had continued to develop the tools to get to impact. We now talk a lot about a zip code is not a destiny. And I just want to bring us up to date from the past to the present by saying those recommendations from HighScope are the kind of recommendations that we need to make in our communities if we don't want zip code to be equated with destiny. It's not just about bringing in a new program. It's not just about making sure we have a new curriculum. It's not just about making sure a young person has a summer job. It really is about changing the way young people have opportunities and experiences with their families to explore a broader set of horizons. So, talking about changing the odds, last year I spent a little bit of time making sure we understand the importance of knowing what the odds are. Now, most of you in your communities now are disaggregating your data. 10 years ago, we weren't necessarily doing that. We weren't having honest discussions that would have had that ACT chart up on the screen at the local level to tell us really what the odds are for young people. I introduced the Social Genome Project last year, which was an amazing effort that the Brookings Institution and Child Trends and the Urban Institute started about 7 years ago to build these basically massive data sets to simulate what happens when a cohort of people go from birth through to adulthood, age 40. And they cobbled together multiple data sets to really have a simulation model so they could ask very detailed what-if questions. What if this intervention happened at this point in time? What if this didn't happen? And see what the implications were in terms of actually changing the odds for the big goal of making sure that everyone was middle class by middle age. Middle class by middle age was defined as being at 200%, 250% of poverty or above by age 29, and 300% above poverty by age 30. You don't have to agree with their definition, but that's how they set the model started. What we learned from them, and I shared this last year, and I've been sharing it across the country over the past year, because I think we have to get ourselves unstuck. We learned from them very clearly that starting off track doesn't mean you stay off track, and vice versa. So I haven't heard it as much as I used to, but you used to hear, if we don't get them by third grade, it's all over. And that's just not true. So they looked at, using the simulation model, they looked at what the determinants were of being on track in every developmental stage. So at family formation, you were more likely as a baby to be on track if you were born to, parents who were married, who had delayed parenthood out of their teens, who had education and employment, and you were born normal birth weight. Early childhood, on track. As you're going into school, your reading and math skills and your social behaviors are on track. And again, I won't read the rest of the list, but those are the things that when they ran the model and they said, how do we increase the likelihood of somebody being successful at these endpoints? Those were the basic behaviors or circumstances that popped up to said, you're on track. The good news or the bad news, whether you're glass half full or glass half empty, is that for the most part, in every developmental group, more young people are on track than off track, right? So from 55% to 70%, young people inside of a developmental group have the skills, the behaviors that are listed to say that they're on track, and the others don't. The other thing to note, however, is that, again, being on track in one age group didn't guarantee that you were on track in the next, right? So you can see that more or less about 70%, 65 to 70%, if you were on track in one age group, you moved on to be on track in the next age group. But people moved off track. The good news, same on the other side. If you were off track, you don't stay off track. Those numbers are about 40%. If you're off track, you've got about a 40% chance to stay off track. So what does that mean? That means there's a lot of movement both directions. And that's the main message that we wanted everybody to hear. There's movement in both directions. So I'm just going to pause and say it again. There's movement in both directions. So development matters. Early and sustained investments matter. We can't assume that because young people are on track at one stage, they're going to be on track in the next, or vice versa. That means we have to be vigilant about both directions. Now, the programs you put in place to be vigilant about both directions are different, and most of our public programs are focused on off track to on track. But if you just barely get on track, and we just leave you, okay, we got you over here, you're on track, something could happen in your life, and you're right back off track. So we have to basically watch from both directions. Does that make sense? So I'm going to stay with this a little more because it's so important for us to really let it seep in when we're working with young people, when we're talking to policymakers, when we're talking to funders. We really have to understand in a good way that resiliency exists throughout the developmental period, and also that when things happen, young people can be pushed off track. We have to understand both of those and get the dynamics. So here's a little bit more data, because as I've been taking this on the road, people have asked, tell me more about what that means and what the relationship is. So what did they learn? They learned being on track is more important than being advantaged at the starting point. So this is data. The darker bars are less advantaged, so you were born off track, versus more advantaged. So what you can see is that obviously being off track, being less advantaged, is a little bit of a disadvantage, but if you manage to succeed in a life stage, right? So the numbers across the bottom, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, are how many of those life stages you were on track on. If you manage to be on track, you were born into a low-income family, but you managed to be on track in all 4 life stages, whether that's taking advantage of policy interventions or just your parents' persistence or whatever, you basically turn out almost as successful as those who were born into a more advantaged family, right? So staying on track is important, and it can overcome the disadvantages that you might have had in the circumstances of your birth. But unfortunately, young people who are from less advantaged families are only half as likely to be on track all the time. And again, it's harder to stay on track if those interventions aren't in place, if those resources aren't in place. Let's look at another thing. Young people who are born to less advantaged families are less likely to be on track at each life stage. We see that. We see that the gap is particularly big in the adolescent years, and I just want you to remember that circle. I'll come back to it. Young people of color are less likely to be on track at every developmental stage. Neither of these things is new information, but it's important for us to know what the odds are, because we can't change them if we don't know them. So how in your communities can you be really clear about the optimism that says if young people get the resources that they need from their families, from their communities, from their schools to stay on track, we really can get them into middle class by middle age. But if we don't provide those resources, and the evidence is that we don't provide them fully enough, these gaps are going to persist. So if we're about changing the odds, we need to know what the odds are. Now, the Social Genome Project didn't go far enough so far. We're going to have them go back and do more analyses to really break this down by race and class. But Raj Chetty did, and a lot of you probably saw the study that was in the New York Times just a month ago. Extensive data shows punishing reach of racism for black boys. How many people saw this? Right? So about half of you saw this. So what they did was to basically show us that if you really look at African American boys and white boys who are born into the top quintile in terms of their family income and track where they end up as adults, being wealthy, if you're African American male, doesn't stick, right? 71% of white boys raised wealthy stay rich or upper middle class as adults, compared to only 38% of black boys. That's the analysis that they put up. The falling happens. The reverse is also true. Being at the bottom, if you're an African American male, you are much more likely to stay at the bottom. You don't rise up from that. Now, I'm not putting these things up to depress you. I'm putting these things up to say, but I'm probably doing a good job, right? I'm putting these up to say we really do need to absorb this level of information and take this as a deep question. What is happening? Because if we don't, whatever we're working on, whether it's bringing social emotional learning into schools more intentionally, whether it's increasing funding for early childhood education, building a more robust after-school system, changing policies so that young people in their 20s who have gotten off track have more time to get back on track, whatever it is that we're working on, and I know you can't work on everything at once, but everything that we're working on has to be informed by this bigger picture of what it looks like in America if you are not born as a middle-class, white, heterosexual male. What does it look like in America? This is one picture of what it looks like if you happen to be born African American male, but there are other pictures, and we need to know, you need to know the pictures that match the communities and match the young people that you're working with. So to finish this story, that income gap exists at every level between white and black men. It doesn't exist for women. You go, well, okay, wow, we dodged a bullet on that one. But then the New York Times comes out with another story. Why are black mothers and babies in the United States dying at more than double the rate of white mothers and babies? The answer has everything to do with the lived experience of being a black woman in America. Again, we have to understand the reality because we can't program ourselves out of this reality. We have to actually be prepared to have deep, hard conversations with ourselves, with our peers, with the people in the communities in which we're serving, and most importantly with the young people, because this is their lived experience. And if we don't help them understand it, if we don't help them give voice to it, then we're in trouble. And we're leaving them to basically figure out how to beat the odds rather than helping them work with us to change the odds. So let's talk a minute about changing the odds, and I'll go through these quickly. Getting a little bit back to optimism. So back to the Social Genome Project. The whole point of doing this analysis, this simulation, the whole point of doing this simulation was basically to figure out what kind of public policies we could put in place that would help close the gaps. So once they identified the gaps and they understood what the modeling was, they then went back and asked, of the people in this simulation, who got what kind of interventions and what worked and what mattered. And so again, the interventions on the screen are typical. For family formulation, it was contraception, pregnancy prevention, social marketing campaigns, for early childhood, home visiting, high-quality preschool. A lot of these are interventions that have put in place. For adolescents, juvenile justice programs, teen pregnancy prevention programs, increasing school quality. You can see the kind of interventions that were in place at a large enough level that they were able to test them to see what works. So what worked? How much do those interventions help? Well, the first answer was early childhood education helps a lot, but if you only just do early childhood education, the impact wanes. Early investments are great, but they don't last. Again, common sense, but we're footnoting common sense. You got a big boost by investments in early childhood education, but if that's the only intervention that people got, it went away pretty quickly. Second, multiple sustained interventions have larger, longer lasting effect on kids who were born into low-income income families, except in adolescence. Look at that middle. I'm going to come back and ask you to talk about this in a minute. So 24% interventions. If you do those interventions in early childhood, you actually get young people from low-income families doing a little bit better than young people from more advantaged families in early childhood. In the other developmental areas, the interventions work well enough to get you close. In adolescence, it doesn't get you much of a gain at all. Again, let's look at the white-black gap and ask, did these interventions help us reduce that gap? Now, I just want to flag for you, this study was completed about 5 years ago. It's looking at people who were born then a lot earlier. So I'm talking about interventions, or they're talking about interventions, where we could have had a lot of progress in figuring out how to tweak these interventions to make them better. So there's good news here. We know we can close these gaps. In Palm Beach, for example, if I'm right, you all have worked on the black-white achievement gap and taken it from, a 25% gap to a 13% point gap, something like that, close enough. So we know we can do this, and we know we're getting better at doing it. So I want to be optimistic, but I'm going to point out again, we were able to cut that gap. So the blue is pre-intervention, the green is post-intervention. You were able to really cut that gap deeply in early childhood, make dents in middle childhood. You get to adolescence, nothing. So I'm going to ask you, I'm going to pause here and give you all a minute to talk to each other at your table. I'm going to pose this question to you. I have my answer, but I want you to think about what your answer is. So I've given you this information. I want us to be optimistic. I'm giving you the idea that we have gone a long way to probably do better at some of the interventions that we use to target adolescents. And adolescence for them is 11 to 19, so basically those teen years. What is going on in adolescence? I'm guessing, and I'm just reminding us that adolescence, of all of these developmental periods, it is the developmental time in which these big words, interventions to address equity, to address quality, and to address opportunity, actually have to intersect. So I'm going to come back and tell you a little bit of the science about why that's important, but I'm going to come down and join a table for a minute. Let's just take about 3 minutes to just talk. In your experience, why do you think, are you surprised or not surprised that when you look at this sort of big data about what works, we don't see the return on investment in adolescence? So talk to yourselves for about 3 minutes. I'll watch the clock and come back and give you my answer. Good. I just learned that my clock was wrong, so I've got about 3 minutes less than I thought, but I wanted you all to stop and talk. I'm going to tell you, just give you a couple of things. I went to a couple of tables, and one table said, maybe the interventions are wrong. Maybe we're not doing the right things in adolescence and intervention. Another table said, maybe we're not doing enough earlier. you talked about adolescence being this time of identity, and if we're not doing enough in the earlier phases and young people hit adolescence, that may be some of the reasons that we stick. If I had time to go around and ask all the tables, I expect we'd get a range of answers. So what I want to do is just say that question, I want you to hang on to that question as you're going through your workshops and you're listening to the plenaries, because we really are taking this journey, and again, a sort of abbreviated version of the slides we did last year. The definition of equality is an outdated definition. Everybody gets the same box. It's outdated basically because we know two things. We know the playing field isn't level, and we know the fence isn't level, right? That fence is, sort of institutional racism, it's structural barriers, it's things that are baked into our systems that we will have to fix if we're really going to get to equity. But getting kids to see over the fence isn't enough. We actually need to talk about opportunity. Why aren't we bolder in saying, get rid of the fence? And then if we actually get rid of the fence, we have to ask, is reducing barriers enough to make sure young people are actually ready to be in the game? Because if that's where we're going, we have to really get a different kind of conversation going. We have to get our young people ready to be in the game. And the message this year is, in order to do that, we have to start by asking them how they see the game or games. Is that even the game they want to be in? Maybe they don't want to be in baseball. Maybe they want to be in soccer or basketball. What are the rules for getting in the game? Do they know them? Are they fair? What resources do they have? In other words, we can't fix this picture without talking to young people. We're just beginning to acknowledge the complex connections between equity, quality, opportunity, and readiness. And again, just putting that CCSSR slide back up as a reminder, the end goal is to get to integrated identity and competence and agency, but that's hard to do if when you move from setting to setting, people have different definitions of what those are, and some people may actively even be working against you or denying you the identity that you want to have. Whether that's a gender identity, race identity, class, we have to, as adults, understand, whether we're on the policy side or the practice side or the research side, that this is complex stuff. And by the time we get to adolescence and young people are actively working on that outer circle, if we don't acknowledge where they are and have them talk to us about where they are, the likelihood is that we're going to get it wrong. Last year I shed the learning pit. Basically, short story of this is learning is hard. We talk about social and emotional learning or social, emotional, and academic development, but it's actually easier for us to grasp what we're working on if you flip it around and say learning is social and emotional. So if I walk into a room and I don't feel emotionally safe or socially accepted, there's already a barrier to learning. Now, I may feel that way and you may not, because you may have been in a room like this before and it worked out for you, but it didn't work out for me. If I come into that room and I start sliding, I don't understand what's going on, it's too hard, I want to quit, and nobody notices, nobody cares, or nobody is surprised, I hit that wall again and again and again. And when I show up in a room in which you think you have done everything to create an opportunity for me to learn and I don't respond, and you think it's my fault, you're not understanding my reality. So I just want us to, I know that we're having many, many sessions about readiness and social and emotional learning, and they're really important, and it's so critically important that we're acknowledging that learning is social and emotional, and that we have to invent environments to help us do this. But we have to go back to this idea that readiness is about the willingness to do something and being prepared to do something. And the psychologists tell us that capacity, motivation, and opportunity are the things that mix together to get a behavior. I just want us to understand that what we see as adults, as practitioners, or what we're looking for as policymakers or funders are changes in behavior. But changes in behavior, especially in adolescence, are a combination of those things, right? And so if you misinterpret my motivation, if you underestimate my capacity, if you create an opportunity that works for you but doesn't work for me, you're going to get a behavior that isn't what you want. And the likelihood is that you're going to assign blame to it in the wrong way and put a policy in place or a program in place to correct the wrong thing. Does that make sense? So if we're going to change the odds for young people, the only way to do it is actually to talk to them, to understand their realities, and to bring that information all the way up from practice through programs up into policy. Quality learning environments matter. I won't talk about this slide, just look at it. The quality definition here is the definition of quality done by the Weichert Center in terms of just creating a developmental context that makes sense. And when young people are in high quality environments defined by being emotionally safe, socially supportive, and intellectually challenging, they learn much better. And that learning is, in this case, is in math from a summer program. Readiness requires us to be systematically making sure that in every system where kids spend their time, from K-12 schools to higher education to juvenile justice programs to employment programs to recreation programs, all of those settings have official practice. And the question is there room for developmental practice? That's got to be what we mean when we say integrating what we know. If we know learning is social and emotional, how do we integrate that knowledge into what we're doing every day officially? We're going to talk with a panel tomorrow with Stephanie Jones from Harvard and Keith Hefner from Youth Communications about how to really bring some of that in a more granular way. So it's not about bringing in a new curriculum, it's about empowering adults who have this understanding to do better developmental practice. In your programs, and I won't read it to you, but in your programs, you've got the key ideas, and one of the things that we did was to go back in time and pull up a page from the paper that we wrote when we started the forum back in 2000. I mean, we wrote the paper in 2000. We started the forum in 98. But we talked about needing to go above and beyond. And as a rallying cry, it's not that the things that we're doing now aren't sufficient. It's that we have to go beyond them. We've got to go beyond prevention. We've got to go beyond quick fixes. We've got to go beyond thinking that kids only need basic services or they need those first that we fix before we develop. We've got to go beyond the school setting, especially for adolescents. I won't read the rest of the list, but all of these ideas come from conversations with adolescents. All of them come from our knowledge that if we are going to change the odds, we actually have to step up our game. So, leaving a minute for anybody, if anybody in the room wants to make a question or a comment, we're going to have about 2 minutes for you to be able to do it after I click through this slide. So, be ready. There are folks with mics. This will be your bonus award for being able to potentially have the last word. The forum really is one organization with one goal: to make sure that we're increasing opportunities for vulnerable youth. We've been having this goal. This is a remake of a picture that we made 20 years ago when we started the forum. We've got two principles: that we have to promote learning in school and beyond, that we have to promote youth involvement. This is about young people contributing to communities and communities contributing to young people. We have two commitments: that we are going to infuse what we know about development into policy and practice, and that we're going to connect with the other development fields: early childhood, youth development, community development, economic development, because this is not just about programming for young people, it's about changing. And then we have 3 strands of work focused on policy, focused on leadership capacity, and focused on improving and strengthening programs and services across settings. That's who we are. Now, depending on how you got here, you might know us by one of those brands. But the point is, and you've got a packet in your folders that explain what all those brands are. And Rita mentioned the idea that we've sort of built these brands over time. But the point is that we are one organization with one goal that hasn't changed. And as we set the course for the next 20 years, and I'm going to warn you now, I won't be standing here 20 years from now. But they will. As we set the course together for the next 20 years, I want to make sure that we understand it's our job to rejuvenate ourselves every year, is to make sure that we know how to move key ideas to impact so that young people are ready for college, work, and life. That means we have to think differently about what we are doing. It means we have to act differently and use our spheres of influence to actually change what we are doing, whether that's in policy, it's in program, it's in philanthropy, and then we do have to act together. And all of that has to happen because whether we make it a poster or not, readiness should be a right for all young people. So with that, I'm going to stop. I'm going to see if there are someone with a hand up that wants to make the closing comment? Any? Okay, you come on up.
You're going to be right over there.
I'm going to be right over there.